On the very day that we had been dreading for 50 years, the day the Supreme Court overturned Roe versus Wade, I was awash with emotion. It was the very same week of some other difficult SCOTUS decisions, ruling that a football coach at a public high school had a constitutional right to pray at the 50-yard line after his team's games, that states with strict limits on carrying guns in public violated the Second Amendment, that a Maine program that excludes religious schools from a state tuition program is a violation of the free exercise of religion. It's kind of a lot. I was scheduled to participate in an important meeting for a grant proposal that Dor Hadash was planning to submit to Jewish Federation. But in the hours leading up to the meeting, however, I was furiously writing an op-ed with other Jewish leaders here in San Diego condemning the Dobbs decision, a decision that stripped away women's bodily autonomy. And I was convinced that nothing else mattered. I joined the meeting late, but I didn't stay long. My rage was debilitating. And I said, I can't focus on this. You guys go write the grant. I trust you, whatever. I gotta go. I need to finish this op-ed. I was unprepared for the anger and the despair that coursed through my veins. I don't consider myself a particularly angry person. I've grown accustomed to letting go of anger that doesn't serve me, of anger that feels only cathartic but not constructive. But with this singular decision, on the heels of what felt like the absolute demise of democracy, I was angry. I actually hate that feeling so much. On some level, though, I would be more terrified if I couldn't feel that kind of emotion. So on that day, I poured out my heart into the op-ed. I had a really good, angry, ugly cry. I donated some money to women's health organizations, and I made sure that my children understood what had just happened. To be clear, there's a lot to be angry about in our world that fuels our interactions and many manifestations of anger. Social discourse and media mechanisms have come literally undone, and cultural divides have worsened, thereby making anger a first response very often, not a calculated one. The primordial history in the Torah is all about these manifestations of anger. The Torah imagines that God's angry that Adam and Eve don't obey and throws them out. Then God is angry at humanity and the world and destroys it, except for Noah, who's okay, relatively speaking. And while God says, I'm never doing that again, humans are evil from their youth, human beings are inevitably going to mess up this world, so what is the point of being angry? We have already been set up to see God's wrath as indicative of some divine character. When the patriarchs and the matriarchs arrive on the scene, however, we don't really see God express that same impulsive, reactive anger that's shown in the first 11 chapters of Genesis. It's only when we meet Moses that we witness the renewal of anger that channels a kind of righteousness against the Egyptian for killing the Israelite, against Pharaoh for oppressing the Hebrews, and even against the people for the creation of the golden calf. These are all examples of how Moses is moved to challenge the status quo in favor of something better. And it's so elevated that Moses has to temper God's anger, which in a moment of divine maturation, unbelievably, Moses does. In addition to the various forms of anger experienced in the Torah, later Jewish tradition has also emphasized the many challenges of anger. Give up anger, abandon fury, do not be vexed, it can only do harm, offers the psalmist. Whoever gets angry, it is as if they are worshiping idols. If they are wise, wisdom will leave. If they are a prophet, prophecy will leave. Verily, the life of the irritable person is no life, teach the rabbis. And the great medieval philosopher Maimonides lays it bare. Anger is such an extremely evil tendency that it is appropriate for a person to distance oneself from it to the other extreme. One should teach oneself never to get angry, even over a matter which befits anger. And yet, while the Torah imagines God's anger as something that can blaze forth, consuming those who have done wrong, that seems not to be the ideal, even for God. When God is imagined to call forth the divine attributes, in the midst of grace, compassion, kindness, and truth, comes two words in Hebrew, erech apayim. Slow to anger. The phrase literally means long of nose, as when one is angry, one might take a long breath before reacting, thereby delaying the anger. There are some 20 verses or more in biblical literature that refer to this slowness of anger. And while not even God is always depicted as measured in the expression of anger, I am newly impressed by the inclination for patience. Not only because of its virtue, but because of what it might afford us in this time of such an onslaught on our values, our relationships, and our very planet. And just before you wonder what I mean when I use the proverbial our in our values or our relationships, our planet, let me invite you to relax. Let me invite you tonight to absorb this message of erech apayim, slow to anger. Especially if you don't like my sermon, I invite you to be slow to anger and slow to email. Give some thought. Because from whatever point on the continuum you find yourself, I'm inviting you to receive these words. We all get angry sometimes over any number of things that may not shake the bedrock of society, but doing so impacts our well-being and the well-being of others. So what happens physiologically when someone or something makes us angry? Well, in brief, there is a cascade of biochemicals that flow to various brain structures. Some structures are below the threshold of consciousness, and others are involved in the higher functions of inhibiting or enhancing reactions, imagining consequences, resisting impulses, and so on. So if the news of the day, or an exchange with a colleague or a loved one, or the latest injustice in the streets stirs echoes of anger in your amygdala, that's the part of the brain in charge of emotions, then your prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain that modulates those emotions, the attention, the impulse inhibition, the cognitive flexibility, probably is going to kick in with some inhibitors to keep you from standing up and screaming at the top of your lungs. But the thing is, when you get angry, the parts of your brain which generate those powerful feelings, well, they're often faster than the parts of the brain that can turn off those feelings. And for good reason. Because in a moment of arousal, such brain function can literally save your life. It doesn't wait for your conscious mind or rationally decide, am I overreacting here? Or is there a legitimate imminent threat? Those cascades will still flood your powerful brain, and it will take time to dissipate. So for an untrained brain, it takes quite a bit of time for the prefrontal cortex to gain control. So it's actually physiologically the case that slowing down an angry reaction will actually help you respond more skillfully and consider consequences and context. It's clear that learning how to process anger appropriately and effectively and then identify what is beneath it and seek to understand it before we choose to unleash it is critical. And because some psychologists hold that anger is really a secondary emotion, meaning that beneath the surface lie any number of primary feelings: embarrassment, fear, grief, shame, overwhelm, depression, guilt, stress, disappointment, loneliness, offense, discomfort, regret, insecurity, hurt. Ever feel any of those things? But ever show those things with anger? Perhaps by identifying what we might actually be feeling, we too can slow our anger and manage our anger. For the ancient Israelites, arrival in the Promised Land is connected to Moses' own anger management. At times, Moses is the very model of patience and support. He stands up to God, who's imagined to want to destroy the people. He argues passionately and persuasively for God to show compassion and mercy. And in both instances, the people are afforded an opportunity for tshuva, to repair the relationship. Yet, as Moses was leading the people through the wilderness, the Israelites began to complain bitterly of everything, but especially thirst. God is imagined to instruct Moses, when the people are thirsty, hit the rock and water will come forth, which he does, and the people are satisfied. But that's in Exodus. In Numbers, consternation and complaints once again emerge from the Israelites, and this time, Moses is instructed to speak to the rock. His talking to the rock will bring forth the water that the people need. You might remember, Moses does not speak to the rock. Moses strikes the rock, not once, but twice, as he was once told to do. But you see, the circumstances here had changed. Only a few verses before, we learned that Miriam died. That was Moses' sister. She's the one who saved him from the Nile. She's the one who brought him to the daughter of Pharaoh. You don't think he was grieving? The text is silent. Moses also calls the people morim, and I don't mean teachers here. I mean bitter ones, the bitter, rebellious ones. You don't think he was as annoyed as any parent being asked over and over again, when are we going to get there? So Moses was very likely taking out his feelings on the people. And this projection of emotion is impulsive. It's not measured. It's understandable that Moses perhaps was not himself. But his emotion is misplaced because there was no erech apayim. There was no slowness to his anger. And it is this moment that changes his life forever. It's because of that moment that he doesn't get to go to the Promised Land. The clearest example of God's own slowness to anger is in Moses' encounter with God just after the golden calf. God is imagined to be frustrated and angry, and he wants to start over with Moses, which is kind of a throwback to the early angry God of Genesis. Into the mouth of God, the text imagines the following words: "Let me be, that my anger may blaze forth against them." God's imagined to say, leave me alone. I have to think. I need space. This is the divine equivalent of a self-induced timeout. But here Moses offers a different kind of timeout. Moses doesn't let God get away with it. Moses offers a different kind of timeout. He doesn't respond angrily, but he says, hey, God, remember your covenant with Abraham? Moses reconnects God with God's own covenant, with a divine sense of purpose and passion. Sometimes when we're so angry, we forget what is really important. In the words of Rabbi David Jaffe in his book, Changing the World from the Inside Out, A Jewish Approach to Social and Personal Change, he writes, connection opens up the possibility for something new, born of love, which was the opportunity for repair and reconciliation. For you see, anger, it sits precariously between two dangerous extremes. One extreme is hatred, which is the breeding ground of violence. And the other extreme is passivity and apathy, the breeding ground of despair and living death. So how do we find that middle place? Where might we find the erech apayim, to speak up, to speak out, to make change for the better? Rabbi Jaffe offers that the middle path is born of significant grief, with the purpose of setting things right. This is the work of savlanut, the midah, the virtue in the musar practice of cultivating one's self and spiritual interior life. Savlanut, which is often translated as patience, is more accurately defined as bearing. For the Hebrew speakers in the room, when you talk about something you lisbol, you are suffering. So savlanut is the bearing of something. And the key to bearing the grief and the despair that's often at the root of anger is that connection that Moses is imagined to have had made for God, connection to ourselves, to others, and even to the source of erech apayim, the aspirational divine attribute. In the words of sociologist Brené Brown, anger is an emotion that we need to transform into something life-giving, not soul-sucking. Courage, love, change, compassion, justice. It's true that such a choice is not always easy or even possible. But the notion of bearing the uncomfortable, bearing the unbearable, in service of something potentially positive, if not rewarding, feels essential for our relationships, and even for bringing a long-term perspective to social justice efforts that are ongoing. How do we engage in fixing our relationships in the world while holding the perspective that our efforts could take a really long time? We can remember that being slow to anger is most effective when couched with mercy and grace and kindness and truth. We only control ourselves, and in a world of contempt and disdain, I'd rather try a little tenderness for my own sake and even for the sake of others. This is what we are saying when we pray Avinu Malkeinu. We are asking God for compassion and generosity, though we may not deserve it. Aseh imanu tzedakah v'chesed ki en banu ma'asim. We are undeserving, and still we want and we need and we desperately hold on to the possibility of compassion, generosity, and love. It is true that all the slowness to anger and grace might not change hearts and minds. And even if my bearing the hardship is rejected and the world around me persists with cruelty and injustice and I can't change it, at least I'll know that my erech apayim, my patience, my bearing, might help to keep the world's inhumanity from changing me. So tonight, on this holiest night of the year, I am asking each of you, each of us, to take hold of your anger. Notice it. Place it out in front of you. What are you truly angry about? Take your anger and your pain and your fear and engage in erech hapayim. Engage in the slowness of emotion for the sake of lasting change. Not because our leaders, our community, our spouses, our children, our family, not because any of them or our friends deserve it, but because a little grace might go a long way for each of us. Gemar Chatima Tova. May our journey towards tshuva be compassionate, be full of grace, be slow to anger, and abounding in kindness and truth.